My wife blocked my final interview for her lover's brunch. Now her lover works for me. She moved the charger while I was in the shower. That's where it started. Not with a confession, not with a confrontation, with a missing cable on the most important morning of my professional life. I missed my final round interview by 4 minutes. Lost the regional director role I'd spent 3 years working toward. My wife told me nothing. Her boyfriend had told her it would help me relax. She believed him. What he didn't tell her was that he had already tried to sabotage my candidacy 3 weeks earlier through an anonymous intake submission. What neither of them knew was that I was a talent acquisition director, and that his name would eventually appear in my own hiring pipeline. He submitted his application 3 days before I pulled the pool. He came in on a Tuesday in a sharp jacket with a rehearsed smile. I let him talk for 40 minutes. I asked all the right questions. I wrote 2 words on my notepad that I never showed him. He left thinking he had a shot. He didn't. But losing the job was the least of what happened to Colin Brewer after he walked out of my building. Viewers, before we continue, please subscribe, like and share. My name is Abraham Johnson. I'm 38 years old, and I work as a director of talent acquisition for a mid-sized tech consulting firm in Austin, Texas. 11 years I've spent in this industry, screening candidates, reading faces across conference tables, deciding who gets a shot and who goes home with a polite rejection email. People think recruiting is just paperwork and LinkedIn. It isn't. It's psychology. It's pattern recognition. It's learning to see what someone is hiding before they know you're looking. I was good at it. Maybe the best in my division. My manager once said I could spot a liar in under 4 minutes. I used to think that was a compliment. Now I'm not sure it was ever true, because the person I failed to read wasn't a candidate sitting across a table from me. She was sleeping beside me every night for 6 years. Her name was Maya Abraham, my wife, though she kept her maiden name professionally. She grew up in Sacramento, daughter of a Nigerian immigrant father who drove a school bus and a Black American mother who taught 8th grade math. She put herself through USC on scholarships and sheer will, got her MBA, and landed a brand strategy director role at a firm here in Austin. Smart, focused, self-made in a way that made every excuse I'd ever heard from mediocre candidates feel embarrassing. I fell in love with her over a Tuesday dinner at a food truck, 3 weeks after meeting her at a mutual friend's birthday. She laughed at something I said, then immediately disagreed with it. That was it for me. We had 6 years together. No children, we kept saying next year. I coached youth basketball on Saturday mornings. I made her coffee before she woke up. I was the kind of husband who remembered small things, how she took her tea, which side of the bed felt safer to her, that she couldn't sleep if the closet door was open. I was also the kind of husband who never saw any of it coming. The morning of the interview, I woke up at 6:14 a.m. without an alarm. That alone should have told me something. I hadn't woken up before my alarm in months. There was a stillness in the apartment that felt different, the kind that sits in a room after something has already happened, before you know what it is. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, then reminded myself what day it was and got up. The final round interview at Harlow and Pine was scheduled for 10 a.m. sharp. This wasn't a routine opportunity. Harlow and Pine was one of the most respected consulting firms in the Southwest, the kind of name that opens other doors just by appearing on your resume. The regional director position they were filling paid 30% more than what I was making, came with equity options, and would have put me in a room with decision-makers I'd spent a decade trying to reach. Sandra, the internal recruiter handling the search, had pulled me aside after my second-round call and said, off the record, "You're the top candidate. Don't give us a reason to change our minds." I had been carrying those words like a stone in my chest for 2 weeks. I showered, dressed, and came to the kitchen at 7:30 to charge my phone before reviewing my notes. The charger I kept coiled beside the coffee maker wasn't there. I checked the counter twice, moved the fruit bowl, looked behind the toaster. Nothing. I went to the bedroom, my backup cable lived on my nightstand. Gone. I opened my laptop bag, checked every pocket of my work bag, walked to the car in my dress shoes and searched the center console and the glove compartment. Nothing. Every charger I owned had disappeared overnight. My phone was at 11%. I stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Maya's side of the counter. Her bag, her keys, her water bottle, all lined up the way she always left them. Neat. Deliberate. I went to her closet shelf where she kept a backup cable for her own phone. It was there. Unplugged. Placed toward the back of the shelf, like it had been moved just far enough to require looking for. I used it. I called Sandra at 10:04 a.m. from a phone that had 4% battery left. She answered on the second ring, and I knew from her tone before she finished her first sentence. Abraham, I'm sorry. We've moved on. I didn't say anything to Maya that evening. I made dinner, asked about her day, listened to her talk about a campaign her team was pitching, and watched her the way I used to watch candidates who were performing well but hiding something. There's a specific kind of fluency people develop when they're managing a secret, answers that come just a half second too smoothly, eye contact that's slightly too steady, laughter that lands just slightly ahead of where it should. I'd seen it across interview tables hundreds of times. I was seeing it now across my own kitchen. Maya and I had hit a real rough patch about 2 years earlier. Nothing explosive, just the slow, quiet erosion that happens when two driven people stop making time to actually see each other. We'd done 4 months of couples therapy with a woman named Dr. Patricia Weems, a soft-spoken counselor in a midtown Austin office who had a gift for asking the question you'd been avoiding. In one session, Maya had said she sometimes felt invisible in our marriage. Not unloved, she clarified. Invisible. Like she was present in my life the way furniture is present, assumed, useful, unexamined. I'd heard it. I'd tried to change. I thought we'd come back from it together. What I didn't know, sitting at that kitchen table watching her eat, was that 14 months ago, at an industry conference in Dallas, Maya had met a man named Colin Brewer. Brand consultant. Easy confidence. The kind of man who makes direct eye contact 30 seconds longer than necessary and calls it charm. I only knew his name because 3 weeks before the interview, I'd seen it flash across Maya's phone screen while she was in the shower. A text, preview visible, can't wait for Thursday. She'd come back into the room, seen me near the counter, picked up her phone without a word, and taken it to the bathroom. I'd told myself it was a work contact. A colleague. Something harmless. Sitting across from her now, watching her laugh at something on her own phone, I stopped telling myself that. I called Sandra the following morning from my office, door closed, voice measured. I told her what had happened with the charger. I wasn't looking for sympathy or a second chance, I'd already accepted that the role was gone. I called because I needed to understand whether the morning itself had been the only problem, or whether something had been working against me longer than that. Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that made the floor feel unsteady beneath me. Honestly, Abraham, I probably shouldn't share this, but there was an anonymous submission through our external intake form, about 3 weeks before your final round. Someone flagged a potential conflict of interest between you and one of our existing clients. We looked into it, didn't find anything substantive, but it did create some internal hesitation. It wasn't the reason you didn't get the role. But it didn't help. I asked her when exactly the submission had come in. She gave me a date. I wrote it down on a post-it note and stared at it after I hung up. 3 weeks before the interview. The same week I had seen Colin's name on Maya's phone. I have a friend named Darius Cole, we played ball together at UT Austin, stayed close through everything after. Darius spent 6 years in the Army doing work he still won't fully describe, then came back to Austin and opened a small private investigation firm that, on paper, specialized in insurance fraud. In practice, Darius could find almost anything about almost anyone within 72 hours, and he had a way of delivering information with the calm detachment of a man reading a weather report. I called him from my car during lunch, parked 3 blocks from the office, engine running. I told him I needed to know who Colin Brewer was. Not rumors. Not impressions. Facts. Give me 2 days, Darius said. I drove back to the office and spent the afternoon interviewing a candidate for a junior analyst role, asking questions in a steady voice, writing notes, performing every function of a man whose life was completely fine. Darius sent me a file on a Thursday morning, a plain PDF attached to a text that said only, "Read this somewhere private." I waited until Maya left for work, sat at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee, and opened it. Colin Brewer, 41. Born in Phoenix, raised partly in Denver. Undergraduate degree from Arizona State, an MBA from a mid-tier program in Colorado. He dressed up on his LinkedIn with strategic vagueness. He'd spent most of his career as a freelance brand consultant, bouncing between firms in Denver, Seattle, and eventually Austin, where he'd relocated 18 months ago. His client list was polished in that way that suggested more presentation than substance: boutique names, a few recognizable logos, nothing you could verify easily without calling someone directly. But it was the second section of Darius's file that made me set down my coffee. Colin had applied for a senior consulting role at Harlow & Pine. The application had been submitted 4 weeks before my final interview. He'd made it to the second round and been screened out. Apparently his references hadn't held up under scrutiny. One former client, when contacted, had described his work as more relational than deliverable focused, which in consulting is a polite way of saying he was better at getting hired than at doing the job. He had applied for the same role I was competing for. He had been eliminated. And then, 2 weeks later, someone had submitted an anonymous tip through Harlow & Pine's external intake system designed to damage my candidacy. I thought about the co-working space. Darius had noted that Colin operated out of a shared workspace in South Austin, a converted warehouse building with about 40 small business tenants. I pulled up the building's website on my phone. Scrolled through the tenant list. Maya's firm had a satellite office in that building. She worked there every other Thursday. I sat with that fact for a long time. The coffee went cold. I didn't notice. I want to tell you I handled the next 2 weeks with discipline and clarity. The truth is messier. I slept badly. I ran longer than usual in the mornings, 6 miles, then 8, trying to physically outpace something I couldn't yet name. I watched Maya with a kind of double vision, seeing 2 versions of her simultaneously, the woman who made me laugh harder than anyone I'd known, and the woman who had placed her phone face down on the nightstand every night for months. I went back through everything I could access without crossing lines I wasn't willing to cross. Bank statements I had legitimate access to showed Thursday lunch charges at restaurants I didn't recognize, not extravagant, but consistent. Every other week for at least 8 months. Calendar invites on our shared family calendar that simply said, "Work lunch," with no location. Small things. The kind of things that are invisible until you're already looking. There was a version of me that wanted to confront her immediately. Lay everything on the table, watch her face, demand an accounting. That version of me was exhausted and hurt and wanted someone to absorb the weight of what I was carrying. But I'd built my entire career on the discipline of not moving until I had the full picture. 11 years of interviewing people had taught me that partial information produces partial conclusions, and partial conclusions make you look like a fool when the rest of the story surfaces. I had learned to wait. To let people finish revealing themselves before I responded. So I waited. And on a Sunday morning, 10 days after reading Darius's file, Maya came out of the bedroom in a sundress, earrings already in, and told me Colin was celebrating landing a new client. That there was a brunch. That she'd be back by 2. She kissed my cheek at the door. I told her to have fun. I stood at the kitchen window and watched her car reverse out of the driveway. Then I called Darius and told him I was ready for the next phase. What I asked Darius for wasn't surveillance. I want to be precise about that, because the distinction mattered to me then and still does. I didn't ask him to follow Maya. I didn't ask for photographs or recordings or anything that would reduce her to evidence in a case I was quietly building. What I asked for was the one thing I still didn't have, the connection between Colin's anonymous submission to Harlow and Pine and a traceable source. Darius came back to me 4 days later with something I hadn't expected. The external intake form submission had originated from a shared IP block registered to the South Austin co-working space. Not a personal device. A shared network, which meant it was difficult to attribute to a single person definitively. But Darius had done something clever. He'd cross-referenced the submission timestamp against the building's publicly accessible visitor log, which the co-working space posted monthly on their website as part of a transparency initiative for their business tenants. Colin had badged into the building at 9:17 a.m. on the morning the submission was sent. The submission timestamp was 9:44 a.m. It wasn't courtroom evidence. But it was enough for me. I sat with the knowledge for a full week before I decided what to do with it. During that week, I behaved like a man with nothing on his mind. I cooked. I went to basketball practice. I had dinner with Maya on a Friday and let her talk for an hour about a rebrand project she was excited about, and I listened, and I asked questions, and I felt the strange doubling again, grief and love and anger all occupying the same space without canceling each other out. Maya's father had spent 30 years being overlooked by men who played harder than he did. She'd watched it, and it had left a mark, a deep, private belief that nice and careful and honest finished last. I think she saw Colin as someone who understood that. Who refused to lose quietly. I think she was still learning what that actually costs. The call came on a Wednesday afternoon in early October. Our VP of Operations, a direct man named Gerald, leaned into my office doorway and told me we had a mid-level brand strategy consulting opening that had just been approved and he needed me to run the full hiring process. Standard timeline. Start interviewing within 2 weeks. I told him I'd pull the applicant pool by end of day. I sat in front of my screen that evening, after most of the office had emptied, and worked through the application systematically the way I always did, sorting by relevant experience, flagging strong matches, setting aside the ones that needed a second look. I was 40 minutes in when I scrolled to a name that stopped me completely. Colin Brewer. Application submitted 3 days prior. Cover letter polished, portfolio link attached, references listed. He had applied to my firm, for a role I was personally managing, without knowing, or perhaps without caring, whose hands it would land in. I read his application twice. Then I did something that surprised even me. I didn't remove it. I didn't flag it negatively. I scheduled him for a first-round interview and sent the confirmation through our standard automated system, which would show the interview was being conducted by Abraham Johnson, Director of Talent Acquisition. I needed him to walk into my building. I needed to sit across from him and take his measure directly, the way I'd taken the measure of 1,000 candidates before him. Not to ambush him. Not to perform anything. I needed to understand, face to face, how much of what had happened had been calculated and how much had simply been careless, because those are two very different things, and in 11 years of this work, I had learned that the difference matters more than most people realize. I closed my laptop, put on my jacket, and drove home in the dark. Maya was already asleep. I stood in the bedroom doorway for a moment, then went to the kitchen and made myself a drink. He came in on a Tuesday at 2 p.m., and I will say this about Colin Brewer, he was exactly as advertised. Tall, composed, dressed in the particular way of men who want to seem effortless while having clearly made considerable effort. He shook my hand with the right amount of pressure and said he was genuinely excited about the opportunity, and he delivered the word genuinely with such practiced ease that I suspected he had no idea how much it revealed about him. I introduced myself by full name, Abraham Johnson, and watched his face the way I'd been trained to watch faces, and the way 11 years of practice had made automatic. The smile didn't break. But something shifted behind his eyes, just for a fraction of a second. A small recalibration. The kind a person makes when they hear a name they recognize from a context they hadn't expected. He knew exactly who I was. I ran the interview cleanly. Behavioral questions, situational prompts, the same structured format I used for every candidate regardless of what I thought of them personally. He was good. Technically fluent, articulate, able to pivot when a question went somewhere uncomfortable. I could see why he'd gotten as far as he had, and I could also see, in the slight overpolish of his answers, the way he never said anything that couldn't be walked back, why his references kept coming back thin. Near the end, I asked a question I hadn't written on my sheet. Tell me about a time you competed with someone for a professional opportunity. How did you handle it? He looked at me for 1 full second before answering. 1 second is a long time in an interview room. Then he smiled and gave a clean, textbook answer about healthy competition and letting the work speak for itself. I wrote 2 words on my notepad, angled away from him. He knows. We shook hands at the door. He thanked me for my time. I told him we'd be in touch. I told Maya that same evening. Not because I'd planned to do it then, I'd imagined, in the weeks leading up to it, that there would be some formal moment, some prepared speech. There wasn't. We were washing dishes side by side after dinner, and something about the ordinary closeness of it, her shoulder near mine, the sound of running water, made the weight of what I'd been carrying suddenly unbearable. I turned off the tap. I told her to sit down. I laid it out the way I would present findings in a debrief, chronological, specific, unemotional. The charger. Sandra's disclosure about the anonymous submission. The co-working space IP. Darius's file. The application timestamp. Colin sitting across from me that afternoon in my own conference room. I watched her face move through expressions I'd never seen on her before, confusion first, then a dawning, then something that looked like a person realizing they'd been standing on ice that was thinner than they knew. She didn't deny the affair. She said that plainly, and it cost her something to say it, and I gave her credit for that even in that moment. What she denied was knowing about the submission. She said Colin had described it as flagging a professional conflict of interest, a courtesy, nothing malicious. She'd believed him. And the charger, she said he'd told her I'd be less stressed that morning if I wasn't anxious about the interview. That she was helping me by helping me let go of the pressure. She'd moved it while I was in the shower. She had believed everything he told her. I thought about her father. About the years she'd spent watching a good man finish last. About how badly she must have wanted to believe she'd finally found someone who played the game differently. I told her I needed space. She moved to the guest room without being asked. I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a long time, listening to the sound of the house settling around me. I didn't hire Colin Brewer. That decision required almost no deliberation. His references came back the same way they had at Harlow and Pine, vague, carefully worded, the kind of lukewarm endorsements that say everything by saying very little. One former colleague, speaking off the record when Darius made a quiet inquiry, used the word transactional. Another said he was better at entering rooms than delivering in them. I sent him a standard rejection through our automated system and didn't add a personal note. He didn't deserve the acknowledgement, and I wasn't going to perform graciousness I didn't feel. What I did instead was forward Darius's documentation, the IP block, the timestamp, the badge log, the timeline connecting Colin's failed Harlow and Pine application to the anonymous submission, directly to Sandra. Not as a legal complaint. Not with instructions. Just as information she deserved to have for her own intake process. What she did with it was entirely her business. 3 weeks later, a contact of mine mentioned that Colin Brewer had gone quiet in the Austin consulting market. 2 firms had quietly closed their doors to him. I didn't ask for details. I filed for divorce on a Tuesday afternoon with a lawyer Darius recommended. Maya didn't contest it. The process was civil and sad in the particular way endings are sad when neither person is entirely a villain, when what happened was the product of two people slowly failing each other and a third person who knew how to walk through the gap. The last time I saw Maya was in a mediator's office downtown. She looked tired and clear, the way people look when they've stopped performing. She said, near the end of the session, I didn't think he would actually do it. I believed her. It didn't change anything. I still coach basketball on Saturday mornings. I still make coffee before sunrise. I got a call last month about a director role at a firm in Nashville. The interview was at 10 a.m. on a Thursday. I was on the call at 9:58, fully charged, completely ready. I got the offer 4 days later. And if you think Colin Brewer disappeared quietly after all of this, you don't know what Darius found in the weeks after the divorce was finalized. Please subscribe, like and share for more interesting stories.